Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Blair. I'm the marketing and communications manager for Prison Yoga Project. And our episode that we have here today is titled Beyond the Bench with Judge Dan Healy, utilizing intercepts for transformative justice. Really looking forward to this conversation. This is something that I've been wanting to hold for our community for quite a long time. Diving deeper into the justice system. What is criminal justice? What are these broader concepts? And then what are ways that our organization, other organizations, and judges have the power to intercept and provide avenues of decarceration, keeping people out of the system? Because we recognize that this system not only inflicts harm, perpetuates harm, but it's like getting caught in a riptide of the ocean, that it keeps people incarcerated and it keeps people oppressed. So really looking forward to this conversation today. Our Honorable Judge Dan Healy. Judge Dan Healy has served on the Solano County Superior Court bench since 2010, providing over felony, mental health, and veteran court calendars. His career is distinguished by his commitment to expanding treatment-based responses within the criminal justice system, including serving on several judicial education committees. Judge Healy is a board member on the California Association of Collaborative Courts and has organized presentations on integrating wellness practices like yoga and breathwork into court settings. He's currently completing a 200-hour yoga teacher training with Prison Yoga Project. Prior to his judicial career, Judge Healy was a criminal law specialist and prominent attorney in the Bay Area for 24 years. Everyone, please welcome Judge Dan Healy.
Hi, everyone. Nice to see you all. Nice to see Jen there, my instructor. I'll add to my resume a little bit and to kind of connect some dots here, which is what I'm going to try to do here. So I grew up here in the Bay Area and was a psychology student at UC Davis back in the late 70s, early 80s. And my college advisor was a well-known person back then by the name of Charlie Tart, Professor Charlie Tart, who wrote books on altered states of consciousness, as well as what they referred to back then as transpersonal psychologies. The idea of taking lessons from the East and incorporating them into our health systems. And so that was I think the first time I did a deeper dive into the ideas of yoga, not just the practices. And back then I approached it really as kind of for myself, as a self-care process, as a transpersonal process to explore a higher ground. And what I did is after graduating, I had a gap year where I worked in a prison. And CMF, which is a prison here in Vacaville, which I believe Blair's last guests, or within the last month, she had two fabulous guests from that same prison, CMF, on the CMF hospice project, which is an incredible thing. Anyway, and that was, and they made reference to, the first AIDS patients. I was working there when the first AIDS patients showed up. I also was working there when the war on crime really went off the rails. And I have off to my right a ceramic Buddha that I've had, a 2-foot ceramic Buddha that I've had since that time. And it was made for me by inmates at CMF when they had robust programming and they were doing woodworking and ceramics, and there were all these programs. And literally of my time there, those programs started getting wiped out right and left. They eliminated the weight rooms. There were people trying meditation programs at the time. All of that kind of got swept out the door over a very quick period of time. And again, this is the early 80s, which really prompted me to change directions and go to law school. Because had the prison environment been maybe even what it is now, I don't know that I would have made that left turn, because I loved this work. And I ended up going to law school, and soon after law school, went back working in prisons. And I was a private practice for 24 years. But for more than 20 years, a couple days a month, I would go to usually CMF, but also San Quentin and death row. And I represented seriously mentally ill inmates who the prison was seeking to medicate. And we would address those issues. And so I spent thousands of hours and had thousands of conversations with seriously mentally ill people in prison. And in the context of medications, it was one of these things, well, yeah, the medications may be helping, but where's everything else? And that was a discussion that never happened. It would be, can they give them their meds or not? Can they not do anything else in the meantime? So anyway, so I did that for 20 something years. And my yoga practice was really kind of as a civilian. I kid you not, my daughter laughs about this. I think there was a 10-year period where there was a particular Rodney Yee DVD that we did every morning. My daughter and I, we did for years and years, the same thing. And that was kind of my yoga space, and it was fun, and it helped and all of that. And I read a lot on the topic, but didn't necessarily fully connect the dots. And in 2010, I ran for it and was elected judge here in my county. And really quickly, what these opportunities started being presented to me, and I'll talk, this is kind of where I'll be coming from in talking about all this, about treatment courts. And that was on the rise just as I had sort of entered law school and left the prison, because the wave of criminal justice was all moving towards the punitive. Right when I took the bench, you started seeing these waves in the other direction, and these winds blowing that started to recognize the importance of having intelligent treatment models rather than these kind of mindless punitive models in criminal justice. So within months of being on the bench, I started doing a drug court calendar, and it's been doing that off and on for the most part. I think 12 of the last 14 years, we've been able to build. And this is based on new laws that got passed in California that I'll mention a little bit. But I think the doors have opened much, much wider to the idea of what we call collaborative courts, or treatment courts, or problem-solving courts. These are all designed to solve the problem, not just to judge things, because the courthouse has established itself as pretty efficient at judging things. What has been less efficient at is fixing things. Mm-hmm. And our communities pay the price. And the more impacted our community is, the more price they pay. And I'm zooming to you this morning from Vallejo, which is where I was born and raised, which is a very impacted community in any number of reasons. So we see all this kind of firsthand. So what I started doing after kind of participation in these treatment courts is I started circling back to things like, what is the value of yoga? What is the value of wellness? What is the value of these other practices for all involved, for the clients we seek to serve, for ourselves? And so that's kind of the orientation. And I sent Blair a couple PowerPoint things that I do from time to time. There are 2 presentations that I do a couple times a year in different contexts. One of them is, again, my impacted community, Vallejo here, was reliant on a very large naval base until it was shut down in the 90s, and basically community abandonment, which is still having ripple effects to this day of people I went to school with, and the lack of economic opportunity. Ironically, what happened, though, is something, the ultimate sword to plowshares, is part of that military base is now a university. And Touro University out of New York established a campus here on the West Coast, here on Mare Island. And one of the programs that they are involved in that I've been a big supporter of, and that I speak to a couple times a year, is they have a medical school. And I believe they have the first, I think there's other ones who have done this now. They have started a master's program specifically focused on health equity and criminal justice. And so I spend time out there speaking with them. That's where I met Anna Proctor, who I'll mention in probably a couple times today. But I do a presentation to them. These are medical students, on understanding the therapeutic nature or in the therapeutic harm of the criminal justice system. And then the other thing I do, Blair mentioned, I'm on the board of CACC, the California Association of Collaborative Courts. There is a national association that used to be called NADCP. It's now referred to as All Rise. And I'll kind of refer you to that up front. If you Google that, what you will find, it's the kind of the leading national organization on this idea of having therapeutic responses in criminal justice settings. And there's a lot of science behind it, and there's a lot of research behind what they are looking to do. And for the last several years, they have allowed me to be their organizer in terms of yoga topics. And so, I've had the opportunity with PYP folks and also the Veterans Yoga Project folks to present. Last year, I presented with the fabulous Chanda Williams down in LA. The year before that was with Victor Reyes and Jennifer Bourgeois in Texas. We're looking at doing some things in Florida next May. But anyway, that's kind of been, and so in that presentation, what I do is I speak to the criminal justice community about why yoga has so much value. And so what I told Blair is I kind of feel like I'm doing the inverse of that right now. And I think where I probably have value speaking to our yoga brothers and sisters is to kind of come at it from the other angle. And I will confess that I changed my notes over the last couple of days in response to the election, because I think that a lot of folks are confused. And I actually think there's a lot more truth that's self-evident, even in how people voted the other day, than people in the context of criminal justice that we're thinking through. So if it's all right, I'll get rolling here. But Blair can interrupt me as we go. But I kind of wanted to roll through this. And let me start from 10,000 feet. And this is the question that you have to answer if you're talking about why am I engaging in the criminal justice system? What are the goals of the criminal justice system? And I'm being mindful of all of those goals. And I'm being mindful of the whole universe that gets affected by what we are doing here. And obviously, at the top of that list, the thing that gets everyone's attention in political campaigns is public safety. People want to be safe. And who's going to argue with that? We all want to be safe. We all should be safe. We all deserve to be safe. Now, safety means a lot of different things. And when we get into discussions of equity and fairness, it becomes a bit of a sticky topic. But you have to start with the ability to talk about that. And what is the flip side of that is accountability. Do we believe in responsibility? Do we believe in accountability? And right now, and I guess my frustration with the argument over the criminal justice system is most of the politicians talk about it in the context of, I want either more or less. And really the answer is, I want smarter, I want better to get to our outcomes, which is, but kind of a lot of the political discussion tends to miss that. And so the phrase that usually comes up in the context of this is rehabilitation. Is if you have folks in the system, how do you get them to not come back? How do you get them to not recidivate? Anyway, that's the context, and that is a discussion. As much as argument there is back and forth in the various political and bureaucratic systems, I think 90% of us agree. We want to be safe. We believe in accountability. We want to be fair. We want to be effective. So remember those things. So when you feel like as someone involved in the criminal justice system that you are maybe on the sidelines here, that you're afraid to talk about accountability because you think it plays into the hands of advocates for long prison sentences and things like that, seize the language, seize the discussion. I'm going to circle back to this at the end in the context of this, but I kind of wanted to start off with that point, because if you're depressed about the election or if you're happy about the election, either way, we've got some work to do. And there is a context to move forward, I think. And in California's election in particular, I see in the list of several friends from San Diego on the chat here. California is a strange place and a really important and leading light place, but I'll circle back to that in a minute. But I think the public is displaying kind of agreement on what we need more than people are recognizing at this moment. But let's if you circle back to what is the criminal justice system? Until recently, it's basically in psychology circles what we call a Pavlovian model, a behavioral model, the idea of punishment. Positive reinforcement, a lot of negative reinforcement. So the two levers that a judge will pull either put you in jail or threaten to put you in jail. And that theoretically was supposed to bring about better outcomes. And what has happened is, and that is still the thing when you see, and I will circle back to this in a minute, when you hear people talking about tough on crime, they are talking about that lever. as if they think just putting you in jail is somehow tough or smart, or that not putting you in jail is somehow enlightened. And it's a lot more complicated than that. And we'll talk about the intercept map and how you deal with people and their struggles and solving problems. But I think there's an opportunity here to move forward and take advantage of this current environment to sort of stabilize and make more firm the gains that have been made in the last 5 to 10 years. And again, getting back to this idea of treatment courts and what we do, the idea is a treatment model. Imagine if you went to the hospital and you went to the diagnostic area and they told you, okay, you've got this disease. Now go sit in the lobby for 6 years. Imagine how we would recognize immediately the absurdity of that response. And yet in the criminal justice system, the big three that permeate our criminal justice system are trauma and mental illness and substance use disorders. So, but imagine if I was talking about bronchitis and I went to the hospital and they said, okay, we figured out you have bronchitis, so go sit in that room for a year. You would say, that's not a hospital, that's an insane asylum. And yet that is traditionally what we have been doing in the criminal justice system. We may get as far as figuring out what the problem is, and oftentimes not even that. We deem the behavior the problem, not the underlying roots, and we just have them go sit somewhere. And that hasn't worked. But before we talk about the intercept, let me talk about 4 kind of concepts. And this is each one of these concepts you could spend a week talking about, and I'm going to do them all in about a minute, each of these concepts. But this is the context to think about the map, to think about what's going on in the criminal justice system, and to think about how to build a responsive wellness system that actually addresses these issues. So the first is the word du jour right now in the criminal justice system, and that word is criminogenic. If those of you who are working in lawyers and in these systems, you are familiar with this word. Criminogenic, you're familiar with carcinogenic? What factors might make someone more likely to get cancer? Criminogenic, what factors might be present that make it more likely that you will commit crime? And there are all these studies and billions of dollars being spent right now, a lot of it as a result of bail reform and these pretrial release systems, and these systems in place right now designed to alleviate the needless jailing of folks. And they've come up with these tests, and they're basically algorithms to see if we can predict who's likely to reoffend or who's likely to be at risk. If you Google that phrase, you'll see people have their different lists of 8 big factors. And right up at the top is, how are you thinking? Do you have pro-social thinking? Or do you have what some of my friends refer to as stinking thinking? Do you have thoughts that undermine your ability to engage positively with the community? And who are you hanging out with? Are you hanging out with peers that support you, that engage, that give your life meaning? Or you're hanging out with other people who are going to kind of lift you up and make you a more productive member of society? And there are other factors. Do you have pro-social leisure activities or hobbies? Do you have something that gives you meaning? And there's really interesting studies out there in regards to the impacts of trauma and pro-social activities and these other events, and just having positive relationships, having positive activities, having something to engage in to give your life meaning actually not only reduces the likelihood that you're going to engage in criminal activity, but it reduces the likelihood that a traumatic event is going to cause you significant harm. It opens the opportunity more quickly to post-traumatic growth as opposed to post-traumatic harm. But criminogenic is the word, and as all of you in your communities, if you go to these meetings and you're advocating for reform in your communities, that word's going to come up, and understand that, what that word means, and the context in which it's being presented, and the context in which it could be addressed. And the context in which it's being presented, it's like Vegas. We're laying down odds and we want you to act on it. That's a very static kind of thing. It doesn't assume the ability to change. Even though if you look at the definition, it says these issues, if unaddressed, increase the likelihood. So from the yoga context, what is this? This is the Dharma, and this is the Sangha, right? How do we build a philosophy, an ethic that, and how do we help other people find that they won't engage in this criminal activity? And how do we build community? You know, one of the most fascinating studies, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the rat park studies. And I'll mention a couple books at some point, but everyone should understand the incredible importance of rat park. And that is, when I was in college, we took these forensic science classes, and the idea was drugs are so addictive that you put a rat in a cage and feed it a drug, and the rat's going to kill itself. It's going to become addicted, and it's going to be unable to stop. And so some clever scientists, this is after I was in school, that I would have loved to have this study in college, came out with the idea of rat park, as they had a study of two different environments. One of them, rats in a cage with drugs. The other one, rats in a community with drugs. So multiple rats and events and activities and things to do, wheels and things like that. That in and of itself radically changed the likelihood that a rat would become addicted to drugs. And that's a metaphor for the world, in my mind, that people don't invoke enough, the lessons of rat park. But again, the idea of criminogenic, everyone, if you're out there advocating for your programs, everyone's saying the advancement this time is about, the arguments are going to be, we need to address criminogenic risk and harm. To which I say, I agree. And how best can we do that? Teach people how to manage themselves. Give people insight. Give people hope. Give people community.
Can I pop in and ask a question about this? Okay, so I know that you talked about like algorithms and all these things. So can you talk, I know that there's so many things that we want to get to today, and I would love to have you back for our broader community and our facilitator community as well for deeper conversations. But I'm curious about implicit bias and how implicit bias is like a lens that's being viewed, whether consciously or unconsciously, when we look at criminogenic marks.
Absolutely. And in California, again, we're doing a number of things. I think we're ahead of the curve in some things. We have done a number of things in this state. We require, and I love this thing, we literally have a jury instruction written that anytime I'm doing a trial case, I read this instruction to the jury multiple times when we're picking them before they start afterwards. And it's instruction 209, if any of you California lawyers are, it's about implicit and explicit bias. Because you study up on bias, and obviously we're all wired. You read Thinking Fast and Slow, which is a fabulous book. Things like that. We're all cognitively wired to have biases, and half the battle is being mindful of it. And again, how do you be mindful of something? You have the tools to be mindful, right? You work on that, but this is a huge issue, and at Turo, the students are really, really engaged on this topic, and there's a million answers to it. One of the things I talk about is this idea of, even beyond these factors, you have to have a system that kind of concedes the difficulty of seeing things with clarity. And that works both ways. In the terms of a client, we struggle every day to deal with a client's perceptions. A client, I may look at a client, the lawyers may look at a client and say they have a drug problem, and the client's thinking they have a judge problem, right? There are situations where we want them to think better. There are a lot of situations where we need ourselves to think better. I'll tell you the most simple example, and there's the obvious ones: racial bias, gender bias, and we work on those things to try to be better and to not have them impacted. I think the one, and this is again another argument for these practices that we're advocating, I think the bias that we don't talk about enough isn't the direct bias that's in front of us. It's the accumulated trauma, the intergenerational trauma that we're still struggling with because of the biases that happened and the actions that happened 20, 30 years ago. So I get in these arguments with folks about, they will say, well, now we are fair, so therefore there's no problem. And kind of, if you take a restorative justice lens and say, but yeah, have we really restored that which was broken by the biases? And that is a little more difficult to see right in front of you. It's more subtle. It's one of these things. But again, circling back to, as we will repeatedly, the idea of trauma and addressing it. So there's so many things there. I talked for hours with these students about this idea of biases, and it's a fascinating thing. I will tell you the one that drives me the most crazy, and these are biases and thinking disorders that are just in front of you that people don't own. And as a judge, I think I frustrate our mental health treatment community when I make this observation, and that is, we will have, and addressing mental health in California has always been huge, but now we have systems that have mandated us to do it, which is all the better. And so it's really in front of us now. We're having these discussions about, all right, what are we doing and how are we doing addressing these things? And all the time, I will refer someone, and we have nowhere near enough resources, some seriously mentally ill person, to our program, a forensic treatment program, and I'll get a letter back saying, well, we can't help them because they are not acknowledging that they are mentally ill. They won't say they need help. And I say, on what planet do I send you to a doctor to treat a condition, and the patient manifests the condition, and you tell me because they're manifesting the condition, therefore I can't treat them? I mean, if I sent you to an oncologist and the oncologist says you got cancer, and the person says, well, I don't think I have cancer, you wouldn't say, okay, I guess I can't treat you. You would find a way to approach the client in a way to get them to understand they have cancer. But there's this weird bias against the mentally ill. And I think it's just an easy excuse for people to offload a client. But I get this all the time, and I say, I've sent you, they have a thinking disorder. That is the definition of mental illness. I have sent you them to you for you to help them. And you're sending it back saying you can't help them because they have a thinking disorder. And on what planet is that their problem? Is that their fault? You know, and so often that is one bias that just drives me up the wall. Anyway, we could talk for years about the criminal justice system and bias, and so that's a whole class onto itself. But let me there's a couple of the concepts I want to put out here, and this starts more to the meat of the intersection of treatment responses and defects in the criminal justice system. And this is a word not as many folks are knowledgeable of, but everyone should. And that is the word iatrogenic harm. If you haven't heard that word, write that down and understand that concept. Iatrogenic harm is where perhaps in good faith, perhaps reasonably, a doctor thought they were giving you a medicine that was going to help, and instead what it did is it made you sicker. And we would not tolerate iatrogenic harm in the medical system. In fact, many trial lawyers have gotten rich just on this particular issue. We do not tolerate the idea of, don't tell me that this is a cure if it's going to make me sicker. And so, which gets you to this question, is the criminal justice system iatrogenic? Does the criminal justice system claim, maybe even in good faith, think it's going to make you healthier, but instead it's really making you sicker? And I'm guessing everyone watching this has a dozen different examples of where you've seen the criminal justice system. How can you possibly think this is making anything better? How can you possibly think releasing a guy from jail at 9 o'clock at night with no supports in place is a good idea? How can you possibly think that cycling folks who are struggling with opioid addictions in and out of jail every 3 or 4 days, just reducing their tolerance, only to have them get back out with no intervention, use again, and die because their tolerance had changed, which is something that has happened to me of people I know, people who are in front of me. I don't know, I don't want to say 100, but it's more than 50 times in the last 4 or 5 years. It's like, what are we doing? And if you sat down in the courtroom on that day, what you would think is, well, I'm faced with nothing but bad options. I don't want to leave them in jail because that's not fair. But if I release them with no services and no help and no hand, they're going to die. You choose. You know, that is kind of the state of what criminal justice looks like in your jails right now. Again, we rouse people and unsheltered people and move them from place to place and we think that without any meaningful intervention, and we think that is doing good, it's causing them trauma every time. It's causing harm. So I think you have to see, and I think you have to be willing to discuss this openly, is that in a lot of ways, the criminal justice emperor has no clothes. And it asserts things, and I'm going to talk about being tough in a minute, but it really is that we are sold that this system is going to help because we've been convinced by whoever that it's helping, and far too often not. We're making things worse. And my concern is about the criminal justice reform movement is that far too often it says, all right, therefore let's have less of it. And I agree, less jail, less whatever we can do to minimize incarcerations, absolutely. But to do nothing and to let the problems languish, to not provide resources and a hand to get them out of the situation that got them there, we're not doing them any favors there. Anyway, the third concept, this is the one, I have mentioned this even at All Rise conferences. I have the experts. I say, tell me about this concept. And they give me a weird look like I'm talking from another planet. And this concept is so obvious to me that I just bring it up. And the word is celerity. C-E-L-E-R-I-T-Y, celerity. The swiftness or the timing of the response. And this is something where if you look behind the curtain, you will see even well-meaning programs saying they are doing something, but their timing is so off that the value of it is grossly minimized or negated completely. I'll give you the simple medical example that I use when I talk in classes. Probably 25 years ago, after playing some soccer, I woke up the next morning and my leg was in all this pain and I could barely walk. And I went to the doctor and they thought, and I didn't know any better, that what I'd done is torn a muscle. What I in fact had was a strep infection in my leg. So I went home for 3 days, after which I went to the hospital, spent a week in the hospital and 3 weeks on an IV because we didn't catch the infection. And in the period of 3 days, I went from something that a couple pills might have solved to a month-long medical intervention. And this is really true. And if you look at your systems in your court, you're going to see that, all right, even though I have the right idea of the response, if I'm not doing it in the right timing, it's of little value. And this is where Cook County, Chicago, actually has been all over this for years. And the jail, they get a lot of bad press out of Chicago, but this is something that their medical team has been really smart about for years. And that is this idea of everyone gets screened within 3 hours of arrival at a jail. And everyone, the first thing we're going to do is upon arrival, we're going to figure out within hours, what do they need? And then we're going to triage and we're going to use this as our roadmap for guiding them out. And when I get to the intercept in a minute, the idea is that if you can do that quickly, Again, just my example of maybe it's only a little bit of medicine rather than a full-blown intervention if I can do this quickly. I'm a big believer of this in detox. If you're, and this is happening across the country, if every jail were mandated to have intelligent detox processes, within that person arriving at the jail, not only would you ease their pain, but you'd have the best window to motivate them to seek treatment. If you had intelligent, medically supervised detox for every person showing up at the jail. But instead we don't. They suffer through pain for 3 or 4 days, and then maybe a week or a month later, we refer them to detox. And by then we've kind of missed the point. But anyway, that's a third thing. And in the Intercept, this is really important. Timing is everything. Catching things quickly as opposed to languishing. One of the biggest reasons why you end up farther downstream than you needed to be in the criminal justice system is because the timing was off in the earlier Intercept. So then the last one, and again, this list go the ever, and this idea gets close to home to the yoga concept, and that is the idea of integration. And if you look at your justice systems and ask yourself, is this integrated? And there's 3 ways to look at integration. The first one is the integrative health model. Am I dealing with the whole person? And if I'm only dealing with things piecemeal, is that really going to be an effective response to help this person move forward? And that's why the VA has this fabulous website, Whole Health for Life. You want to see a model of something that they are looking to do this very thing. And the idea of addressing all of these issues at once. And this is where wellness comes into it to a huge degree. And I'll circle back to a minute. The second idea of integration is what I refer to as horizontal integration, which is what the euphemism that you hear in treatment circles is wraparound care. Am I addressing all of your needs? Or we have a place where we can address all those needs? Or are we piecemealing you and siloing services and sending them around? This is a really huge thing. Again, the ability and the quality of your wraparound care in the early stages dramatically impacts the likelihood that you're going to be in the later stages of the criminal justice system. And then the third type of integration is what I'd call vertical integration, and that's what we refer to as continuity of care. And a lot of systems are really guilty of this. And part of this is a byproduct of just not having good information systems and bureaucratic behavior. But for someone to repeatedly show back up, more often than not, it's repeating the wheel. And there's no relationship there, so they start from scratch. If someone gets arrested, it's amazing how many times they get asked questions that they have answered before. And in terms of the smooth handoff from place to place, this is where reentry is a huge issue. I was referencing earlier prisons and jail and exit strategies and reentry strategies. And it is amazing how late to the game everyone is in terms of recognizing how incredibly important a smooth handoff from transition to transition from residential treatment to follow-up to outpatient, from transition to jail back to your community. There's just a million opportunities there. So that's the framework that I really think you all should feel empowered to discuss when you show up at these meetings and someone looking at you, oh, you're just that yoga person, while we sit here and talk about, the big issues of criminal justice. Don't let them do that. You have more understanding about these issues than most of the people in that room. And the issue really isn't an understanding thing, it's an accountability thing. Are these folks who we entrust with these systems, are they being held accountable to address these issues? So And there's a whole bunch of subtext to all of this. The idea of meeting them where they are instead of where I am, and being open to the idea of the manner of engagement makes a lot of difference. I'll tell you an interesting stat. This statistic has been around for years. And for those of you who are involved in court, most of your judges have probably heard this stat, or they should have heard this stat. Just something as simple as this. Someone did this study, and this was of people in court, in terms of whether or not the manner in which a judge engaged with the client made a difference. And the study established that if I spend 3 minutes talking with somebody, engaging them, seeing them as a person, that in and of itself, not even necessarily what the content is, just the fact that I saw someone, I engaged in someone, I drew them out a little bit, that creates statistically significant improvements in outcomes. That little thing. So again, for the yogis in the room, namaste is not a greeting, it's a concept. It's an action plan. That in the context of doing all of this work, and there's a lot of really good work going on right now on best practices in motivational interviewing and motivational engagement and things like that. Our police officers and our correctional officers sure could use a lot more of that, and CI, crisis intervention training and things like that. But again, what a lot of this comes back to is this idea of what we talk about in treatment score, of a healer's mindset, right? Not what am I going to do to move a calendar, not what am I going to do to look like I'm being tough, what am I going to do to bring about some healing? That's the restorative justice model. That is, again, the treatment model. So, what we, and I didn't, this we're not really set up here. If you Google the idea of an intercept map, which is how this kind of got teed up as we would discuss, what you will see is, and this is where a lot of the justice reform is directed these days, at this idea of where earlier on the river might I have brought you to shore. In what part of your engagement with the criminal justice system might, if I had different responses, we had better outcomes. And so if I were advocating to the PYP folks, the idea would be the prison work is fabulous, and we need a lot more of it, but we need a lot more of it upstream as well. And I think there's huge opportunities there to do that. I should share. Let me circle back for a minute just to tell. I said I was going to mention Anna Proctor, who I just worship. So one of our PYP yoga trainer, very informed leaders here in California, Anna Proctor. So I met her, and we communicate all the time about this and that. And she actually volunteered to work with some of our drug court clients here for a while before the pandemic. But she invited me to be a guest. She had a graduation up at CSP Solano, the sister prison up in Vacaville, the street here, of 9 lifers who had all gained their yoga instructor certificates. And it was 9, so there were 18 inmates there because there were 9 lifers, and each of them brought a guest, and Anna and I. And to this day, I am crushed that I could not record it, because it was the most magical thing. She had everyone go around the room, and everyone led us all in one chair yoga exercise. And these are 9 lifers. These are prisoners. A couple of them I know what they were convicted of, but I don't go down that road with them. The work that the Prison Yoga Project is doing in these prisons is just extraordinary. And I had this great opportunity to sit through that. And I'm still, every time I see Anna, I still talk to her about it, because it was just the most amazing thing. And so in everything I'm talking about of the kind of leading up to how to keep people out of their prison, I wanted to stop and kind of acknowledge that the work itself that everyone is doing now is just extraordinary. But let me circle back to the idea of the intercept map and treatment courts, and what are we looking to do? And I mentioned that the big three, your algorithm, and those folks, your pretrial services folks are going to talk about the criminogenic risks and those 8 things and your friends and things and your prior history and things like that. The bottom line is where the real work to be done is in the 3 things I mentioned, which are kind of really one thing: trauma, mental illness, substance use disorders. If the sooner we can address those things, the quicker we're going to get people off this road to prison and road back to prison. And so what has happened is we're starting to see small little steps. And this is where in your community, every community is going to be different. You have to become a master in some other skills. You have to become a master of the bureaucracy. You have to become a master of Medicaid and funding streams and clients' health information systems. That is the work that we need to do, along with the treatment work and along with the breathing and the sitting and the being. But that is the work we need to do to address those things. So the quicker, the earlier we can address trauma, the more chances we're going to have to keep them out of prison. So where do we do that? At Intercept Zero in our community? Are we in our schools? Are these services that we are providing, I love what Nikki Myers does, and I think she's going down this road that is undertapped at this point, because the AA has this really robust community, and the 12-step part absolutely gives folks meaning and a framework to live their lives. But what Nikki is doing, and first, I assume a lot of you know Nikki Myers and the kind of trauma-informed, yoga-based 12-step, and support that in your community, because there a lot of times there's folks we see in jail or in prison. There was an opportunity before that. They went to a meeting. They were talking to their doctor, and the quicker we can give them these tools to do and make available this work, the more we're going to get them off the path. When you go down the Intercepts, so I don't have it in front of me, but I think there's community interventions. Are your police responders, are they kind of trauma informed? Do they have a good crisis intervention training program where they don't, rather than when they appear, which is often the case, they will appear, someone is in mental crisis, things will escalate, as no shock there, and it will result in the person being arrested. Do our interveners and do our systems have a different set of skills that maybe I can handle that differently? Does my community have meaningful detox? Or if someone, which is a kind of a recurring tragic problem in my community, you'll see unsheltered folks using opioids and they'll do something that gets them arrested, something as small as public camping, and they'll end up in jail. And if we have this other place for them to detox, for them to feel safe, for them to be given some tools to get themselves out of the pain and the struggle that they're doing, there's a huge opportunity there. When you get to, earlier I said I was going to mention California. California is in the middle, and I get calls from judges all over the country right now on this topic. We are in the middle of this really interesting and incredibly important experiment that we call mental health diversion. And the public, I made mention earlier, the public's smarter and in more agreement than I think the politicians want to admit. And I think the public, even if you saw the election the other day, the public doesn't want to go back to just mindlessly jailing people. They want our systems to be accountable to help people and to solve the problems. And so in California, we have this mental health diversion statute, which is really robust, basically establishes that if someone has a mental illness, we have to divert them unless we have limited reasons why. The legislature did not trust, and they may have been wise in that distrust. I'll leave it to others to decide that. The judges, because they thought we'd all deny it all because we want to be tough and not freak people out. But we are in this experiment right now where we are diverting folks from the criminal justice system right and left. And whether or not this succeeds, and I do our calendar. I built our calendar. I love that calendar. My staff, it drives them up the wall, but I love it. But whether or not it's going to succeed or fail is based dependently a lot on whether or not we have the community resources to support these folks. And right now, I'm a little concerned that we're under-resourced and it's a bit of a shell game where we divert people, and it's only a delayed action because if they can't succeed on diversion, the charges get reinstated. But anyway, right there, right now, there is this giant gap. I'm in the middle of this challenge, and this is one I engage with kind of statewide judges on this topic, and I'm the leading complainer on this particular issue, is if you imagine mental health diversion and treatment responses, the low-hanging fruit, the easiest ones are the schizophrenics, the severely bipolar, the ones with psychotic disorders, for whom medication intervention really dials down 70-80% of the problem. And then we can program them along with that. Those are the kind of the more simpler ones that the system has in place an ability to respond. There's this more complicated and interesting, and this circles back to Blair's question about equity. There is this more complicated challenge that I invite the smart folks on the Zoom to solve this problem. Again, the statute is defined really broadly, and it includes a lot of mental health diagnoses for which you're presumably to give someone diversion, including PTSD. So imagine a 20-year-old whose mother was murdered in front of him when he was 10, who was brought through the foster system and never got through school, spent a lot of time in facilities where, again, the contagion effect, the iatrogenic effect of that incarceration just made things worse. He got bad ideas, he got bad peers, he got all of those things. And he gets arrested with a gun at age 20. And I've got 4 or 5 of these cases right now where my position is I absolutely want to divert this case for every reason imaginable. Tell me what the plan is. What is the treatment plan? And it's crickets, because we have a medical system that assumes that the solution is meds or maybe one telecare appointment with a therapist once a month. And that is not the solution. And circle back to what we all know about trauma. That is not the solution. But where is the resources? Where is the program to do that? It's going to be some combination of some cognitive behavioral therapy, some positive pro-social engagement with a group of folks. What I think, in particular, as to the impulsivity issue, I think it's yoga. I think teaching folks to master themselves is the therapeutic path forward. But who's funding that right now? So I circle back to someone needs to get really good at Medicaid and know how to master the bureaucracy to figure out how to force your community to fund these things. But so in any event, kind of circling back, we've done some things pretty good in the last decade in terms of treatment responses, big expansion of cognitive behavioral therapy. There is a phrase, MAT, if some of you may be familiar with, which we call medication-assisted treatment. Suboxone is probably the one a lot of you may be familiar with, Narcan being the other. And it's been effective in helping folks. but it is not a solution. So at All Rise, I started calling my presentation the other MAT, because everyone was into medication-assisted treatment and opioid responder drugs and antagonists and agonists and all that. And so I started calling my presentation the other MAT, which is the mindfulness-assisted treatment. How do we do that? And this universe is wide open. So any one of you watching this, you could be the person to bring all of this to your community. And this is how you bring healing to your community. And this is how you keep folks out of prison. And so what does that look like? It's a whole range of things that we don't talk about in the criminal justice system. Nutrition makes a huge difference. There's this guy I work with. I love this guy, professor, now retired here in California, who this is his topic. And he did studies on the statistically significant improvement on kids' behaviors in juvenile hall if you give them a multivitamin. That's the most basic one, but there are 100 of those. And we all know this in this universe. Why aren't those principles being applied in justice settings from pretrial to prison? The idea of sleep. This is one I'm actually, for All Rise, I put together a couple proposals, extra proposals this year. And one of them is on sleep, of which Yoga Nidra is part. And the idea is, why don't we recognize the importance of sleep in terms of kind of adequate brain function? And why don't we take steps to address that? Something as simple as nature and light. I made mention earlier about the 20 years of times I spent sat with guys in a cell about whether or not they needed psych meds. And what a lot of them needed was daylight, to feel their feet on grass. One of the great things about the hospice, the guests you had a couple weeks ago, is they have a lawn. And one of the rare experiences in that little hospice mode is one of the things you can do, which you are not free to do anywhere else in that prison, is take off your feet and walk on grass. That's a revelatory thing, that in and of itself. Obviously exercise. I'm a big fan of sound. I was up at our juvenile hall a couple of weeks ago, sitting in the back of the room watching someone do a sound bath for 6 young men. And it was really fun, and it's really life-changing. That provides a format. That's not the solution, but it's the entree to, hey, let's talk about how your mind felt and what space is and what sound is, and let's talk about that. Let's talk about recognizing that you are not the elephant, you are the driver of the elephant, sort of thing. So in any event, let me. I've been riffing here for a while, which is what I tend to do. Let me circle back to that is all what I talk about with the Thoreau students. That is my argument to the yoga community about how it is wide open in terms of the opportunities here from each intercept, from soup to nuts, from every part of the criminal justice system. So what do I tell? And I'm going to read you a couple of quotes here that I think will encapsulate why this is the arguments that I make at All Rise, at these conferences when we do this. Why yoga? Number one, safety. There are really good, in fact, I think the most popular cognitive behavioral session right now is entitled Seeking Safety, and recognizing the importance of safety. So a lot of you are probably familiar with Father Boyle, Homeboy Industries in LA. Quote, "The reality of everyone who walks through our doors is that they live under constant threat. They breathe in shame with every breath. We welcome them so they can first breathe easier and second, breathe differently." Right? Simple start. That is yoga, right? The second one is space. I listened to an Andrew Huberman podcast a month ago, and he was kind of ridiculing this idea of space a little bit. And that kind of bugged me, because I think this is so important. And a lot of you have probably seen Viktor Frankl's famous quote, "Between the stimulus and the response, there is a space. And in that space lies our freedom and power to choose our responses. And in our responses lies our growth and our freedom." That's the opening line when you're talking to kids in the hall about yoga. I want you to be free. And for you to be free, you need to control things. We need to create some space between that stimulus and your response so you can choose. You know, they're not getting that with psych meds, right? This is why the work you're all doing is so important. The third thing, stillness. And you're all probably familiar. Again, I was mentioning several of the books. I'm assuming a lot of you have read Gabor Mate, who is a really leading light on this topic. Bessel van der Kolk. Again, the body keeps the score. Quote, neuroscience research shows that the only way we can change the way we feel is by becoming aware of our inner experiences and learning to befriend what is going on inside ourselves. Right, I was saying earlier, where do we find a path forward for young men in trauma? We find it in helping them find community, in helping them get a mindset that A, gives them some control, gives them some power over themselves, but also provides a framework for them to have this positive work going forward. So let me wrap up here with two things. And I appreciate you guys letting me, this is like therapeutic for me. So I appreciate you letting me be subject to all this. Here is what all of you, this is the mantra that all of you need to adopt and say every day. I am tough on crime. Right? That is this thing you're all resisting. And on this political election the other day, you saw, well, people are afraid and they want to be tough on crime. And it's the most mindless nonsense you will hear anywhere. And they've been ceded that territory by politicians who can't figure out how to present this. There is nothing tougher than having a history of serious trauma and sitting with it. There is nothing tougher, there is nothing braver than making amends, than entering that space. And that is why we use, and that is why we react, and that is why we get violent, because we cannot hold ourselves in that space. And when we empower folks with the tools to hold themselves in that space, that is the toughest thing that they can do. That is the toughest thing that we can do in supporting them. So don't buy all this nonsense about somehow this is all hug-a-thug softness in response to this more kind of righteous and angry response. Those responses are lazy and they are uninformed. They do not make victims' lives any better. They do not make your community any safer. They feel good on TV because of all the justice porn we've all been subjected to for the last 50 years. But so you need to be the front line of this. And I know that's a framing that a lot of people are uncomfortable with because they don't like that framing of tough on crime. Be a little Aikido on this. Make that force your own. You are tough on crime, and don't let anyone tell you that you are not. The second thing I do, I get a little gasp out of when I use this, I riff on this at All Rise, and I get a bit of a gasp of the room, especially of the drug treatment community. And it usually goes something like this. You know what? I want to get high. And you hear the gasp right there. And when someone tells me they want to get high, rather than saying, well, that's a negative thought, you need to be realistic, you're in treatment, you need to do this, it's good for you. I want you to get high. What I don't want you to be confused is what you think is high isn't actually high. You're spun here. The value, and I circle back to this is how I started. When I first learned about yoga, it was not about a therapeutic response. It was about a tool to elevate myself to higher ground, a transpersonal response. Own that space as well. And people are afraid to own that. Especially dealing with younger kids, we're all afraid. We got so caught up in this just say no mentality that we're afraid to talk about the fact that you should want to transcend things. Once you get past Maslow, there is more. There are higher things you can seek. And again, embrace that and don't be intimidated by folks who shut you down and saying that's the wrong message. That is the right message. The wrong message is, I'm going to take drugs to get high, or I'm going to do this to get high. It is, but there are tools out there. I applaud you for having a Northern Star. I applaud you for wanting to learn to breathe or to pray or to sit in a way that can get you to a better place. You are all those northern lights and can do that and embrace that. Don't shy away from that, and don't let the traditional language of kind of repressive criminal justice get in your way. So I actually had, I'll try to do this in a minute. So here's if I had an action plan for you, here's my action plan. Do what I just said. Reframe all of this to become you. This is criminal justice reform. Don't seed the field by just saying there ought to be less of it. Take it to everyone and say every step should be better. By definition, if it's better, we're going to have fewer people in prison. By definition, if it's better, we're going to have fewer people in jail. It's not about defunding, it's about refunding correctly. So I don't back away from that as a criminal justice reform. You can find intercepts and partners in your community, and every community is going to look different. I suspect in most of your communities, your probation department is going to be your best bet. We have a really enlightened probation department, and across my courthouse here, they built several years ago what we call the Center for Positive Change. And it's a resource where they have groups, and it got, again, the pandemic hit it a little bit, where there are groups, and I've been pushing for them to be a regular yoga provider, and I haven't figured out a way to fund that yet, so I'm not doing it. But but anyway, partner with someone in your community to do that. Again, advocate for your jails and prisons to be accountable and to be trauma competent. Blair and I were talking about this earlier. There is this revelatory thing that I don't think we've embraced enough. Is your prison probably has tablets. And so your jails may have tablets. There is new technology right now where you can take the lessons you're trying to deliver and put them in every prison in the country. And I'm actually meeting with someone this afternoon about California, trying to do exactly that for the PYP. And then again, I circle back to someone needs to be as boring, and I was terrible in accounting. But you should elevate that person who is really good at understanding government funding. Recognize how important Medicaid is. I go to meetings with folks and they tell me, there's billions of dollars for this, and there's billions of dollars for that. And then I talk to our crew, but no one knows how to access all of that. So that person could be your hero too. Anyway, that was quite a rant. But hey, thank you for letting me do that. That covered most of my notes. And
I think if your schedule allows, I think we need like a teach-in, like a half-day sit-in, because I could take a bio break and come back for another 2 hours. This has been instrumental and inspiring, especially after what I think so many are perceiving as like a defeating week. Thank you. I was hearing so much, and I have 4 pages of notes that I even took, but I'm hearing like community. There are ways, there are systems, there are needs, there is money to show up in community, and to really to the tincture, I think, of the time that we are in is that we need to build new systems. And you are a leader in building those new systems. You are working within the inside to build this. And I think some of our duty is to build these systems on the outside.
That's exactly right. There's a million. I talk about the funding thing. Each community is different. In my community, I'm really frustrated. There were billions of dollars in opioid settlement money that are back to communities. And why some of that isn't being invested in programs like this, I have no idea. But in your community, maybe you can get them. I'm told in Colorado they're doing some more progressive things on some of these topics. But in terms of the community, yeah, the idea of everyone convening in order to swap notes and get best practices in front of everybody else. I think that's what All Rise does nicely. In the treatment court community, do a very nice job of getting together every year and swapping notes on who's doing the best stuff. And there's probably something to be said for the yoga community to do that.
This has been so inspiring for me, and you made my job so easy. I just got to sit here and jump into the chat, and you dove into every topic and all of these aspects. And just thank you for your work. Thank you for the way that you've been showing up for your community for years and years, and just being that leader, carving the path in the dark. So thank you. We are just so grateful to be able to be in community with you, to be able to continue and build on this work. We didn't get to too many questions, but I do have one question. You are a judge, and we've talked about how much impact your position holds. I'm really curious, what is the landscape of other judges in the US? Like, is this catching like fire? Is there opposition? Like, what is the landscape of judges and this intercept model?
Boy, I don't know. It's hard to. I think far too often the intercept model and bail reform all was driven by two things. Some of it by legislation, and the other part of it is a couple federal cases, kind of changing the landscape. Humphreys and changing the landscape of bail reform. I don't want to get in too much trouble here. I can't say it's hard. I'll answer this question, I think, strategically correctly. As to the overall court thing, I don't know, and depending on the room we were in, and maybe if I'd had a beer or not, my answer would be a little different. But what I can say is, in a lot of communities, there are incredible judges out there leading this work. I don't think I'm an outlier. I don't think I'm in the majority of things. But there are really impressive, and part of my work is kind of fun. Is I have the privilege of working with them. So I'm on different committees. I'm on this Zoom committee once a month with the judges in California that work on mental health issues and things like that. And so there's some out there. So I don't know. I think it tends to to answer your question, the court is probably a little more likely to be a follower rather than a leader on these reforms. And I think the reforms are going to need to be driven up from the community. But in California, it's the legislature. To its credit, the California legislature has been pushing the court to do things because it didn't take the court's word that it was doing enough on its own. And so every community is different. Go to your board of soups in your county. That is probably where you can have the most kind of immediate impact on things.
I'm putting it into the chat. I have so many notes on here for the recording. You'll be able to click on these notes in the podcast description. Honorable Judge Dan Healy, thank you so much for showing up and carving out time to be with us. And you are an integral part of our community. You are part of our community. And I hope that this has been inspiring to everyone on this call. Thank you for your wisdom and your knowledge and your lived experience, and just passing that down to us. Endless thank yous.
Well, thank you for having me. And I should encourage folks. I'm just wrapping up with Jen and the yoga. We'll talk about that some other time. But it's a fabulous thing. If any of you are thinking about doing it, I spent the last 5-6 months doing that, and it was a really worthwhile thing.
Thank you. And Judge Dan Healy is talking about our 200-hour yoga teacher training that we run twice a year. Registration is opening up November 15th, and we start in January. Thank you to our community. Thank you, everyone, for showing up. We wouldn't be able to have these conversations if you didn't show up and you were part of this community. Thank you to our facilitators. Thank you to our community that's incarcerated that we get to serve week after week during our classes. Again, thank you so much, Judge, for being here, and we'll see you next time.